It's a common question I get. How do you set healthy boundaries with my Filipino relationships, you ask, especially difficult ones? One thing's for sure, healthy boundary setting is essential, but when it's not culturally responsive, it can bring more harm to the relationship than good. In this episode, let's explore the different experiences you and I have about the word boundary, how not to set up one, and how to set healthier ones in your Filipino relationships. Are Filipinos truly bilingual? We use the same language at home but speak in love languages foreign to each other, together but separated. Kamusta? I'm Roanne, licensed psychotherapist mom, immigrant twice, first generation Pinoy raising my mixed Filipino-American children in America. I found that after visiting 500 Filipino homes, I continue to be a student of the culture. In this podcast, we would be seatmates in this beautiful cultural classroom. And by the way, did I tell you I need my kapeng barako straight from Batangas before each class? If you're interested in learning the deep intricacies of the Filipino culture, especially as it merged with American culture, talks about trauma-informed care, and deepening your Filipino relationships across generations, which includes my fave topic, Pinoy love languages, you're in the right place. This episode is brought to you by the Inner Child Healing 30 Days course, 30 days of creative prompts. Sometimes setting boundary isn't healthy when you have feelings of deep hurt and or violation that you've felt in the past that had not been witnessed. In this course, which is made of 30 simple, less than 10-minute prompts, you can begin to heal, to nurture your inner child. Visit the link in the show notes. Welcome everyone. It's a beautiful Thursday that I am recording this episode. I'm Roanne. I'm your host for the Pinoy Love Language podcast. Now let's define boundary. When you think about boundary, as I am saying that word right now, and as you listen, what image comes up for you? What do you imagine? What do you visualize? Whatever you have there, bookmark that. That says a lot about what that means to you. And that would mean very different things to different people. Now, I will go back to that imagery, but let's talk about why do you need healthy boundaries? I think about the house. To visualize a house right now, but without a border, you know where you live and you know where your neighbor next door, where their property starts and ends. And without border, you can be open to friendly visits for sure, but also unfriendly ones. The border serves both parties, but especially the owner of the home, because you would be able to send a message to the outsider who's welcome, who's not yet welcome if you're still getting to know someone, and who's not welcome at all. So it's mutually beneficial to have a healthy boundary. It's human to discriminate, to size up a person. This is very human. Even children 6 months old, we say that they have a stranger anxiety because now at that age, they've seen usually the mother enough that they know that not every woman is their mother. And if you hand them to another person, they're like, oh, not mother, looks to the mother, that's my mother, and starts crying. Of course, not all babies are like this, but this often happens. And if you had a baby prior to the realization, before that stranger anxiety kicks in, usually you can pass babies around. But in a collective society, the mother, that role can sometimes be shared. So it's not the only mother. There are surrogate mothers. So sometimes we call that cooperative breeding, where it's the collective that's tending to the child. And this is a lot of informal support systems like the lola or the kapitbahay, the neighbor. So it's human to discriminate. Now, let me talk about the cultural aspect of boundary. There's a difference with the bubble. I talk about this often. The bubble, that the proximity between two people, between Filipinos and Americans. And this bubble tells us how much closeness or distance we need so that we feel comfortable, that with the other person. We know that for Americans, that is so much more distance there compared to the Filipino, which are very collective and very close. On that note, the parental goal of the Filipino is very different with the American parental goal. Of course, with anything we say, it's always a generalization. You might say, if you're listening, oh, my parents aren't like that. Of course, because there's always an exception. But in general, Filipinos, especially in the Philippines, their parental goal is to make sure the child can successfully enter groups, which means fostering interdependence. Sometimes we have a negative connotation when we hear that word. I mean that just from a neutral place. It simply means that you can rely on someone, and also it is emphasized that someone also needs to be able to rely on you. So as you rely on someone, you should also be reliable, is the expectation. One of which parents teach their children to read nonverbal cues. That's very important to be a part of the group, to watch cues, to watch movements, nuances in the facial movement, nuances in sounds. Like we hear our moms or our tito go the TSK, and we become alert of different meanings that may have. In a collective Filipino parenting goal, it's interdependence, okay? This is our space, is taught. In the American parental goal, it's actually for the child to be independent. So as soon as the child learns to sit up, balance their neck, the child is placed in a high chair. So the child learns to be independent. There's nothing wrong with this. And what I love about talking about culture is not that there's something wrong, but it's simply something different. Okay? And then the child is learned or taught to self-regulate. One way is to be able to articulate their needs. I'm feeling sad. I need this. And if someone stole your toy, you tell them what you want. This is not your toy. This is my toy. In the American parental goal, there are many different goals. This is super simplification. If the Filipino is teaching, this is our space, in the American parental goal, it teaches the child, this is my space. Okay. Now, I want to say before I proceed, there are violation of boundary that is across culture. Okay. That no one will say that, oh, that's cultural. For instance, any violation of sexual, physical, psychological, where consent is one way. And when I say consent, this is when someone can consent, when they are developmentally able to do that and appropriately able to consent. There are some debates these days on consent that I will not get into. I do not mean it in that way. I just mean a child could not consent on many things just yet, but can on certain things. So violation of boundaries do happen. Now, although expression in feelings, we say, in American culture, would say, yeah, Filipinos are not very expressive about their feelings. It's usually unpleasant feelings that they're not expressive. But once you get to know, they warm up to you, Filipinos are actually very expressive. It usually are pleasant feelings for them. And they're very expressive in their bodily movements, in closeness. If you just observe Filipinos who are strangers in jeepneys, they squeeze like sardines and are pretty comfortable doing that. If you observe children after school, how even boys do an akbay, which is they put their arm around another kid, a classmate, and how girls are holding hands. They value physical closeness so much. Now, kids raised in America value personal space. The space becomes, the we space becomes clear when the I space is clearly quantified. Let me repeat that again. So in America, the we space, the space that we share, becomes clear when the I space is clearly quantified. The opposite is true. Again, this is a generalization. It's opposite for the Filipino family. The I space, the space for you, becomes clear when the we space is quantified. So to make this real for you, I'm going to use a metaphor. So I'll use the house and the lot metaphor. So in the Filipino culture, every person is a house. The house will not just set itself. It look for a lot first. Once it finds a lot, then it'll figure out where to place itself, considering also the other houses that belongs in that lot. That's what I mean when I say that the I will be more distinct when the we is clearly quantified. Opposite of that metaphor is the house wants to clearly know how big it is, so then it can find a lot. So it's the opposite. So I hope that gives you a clearer difference. Now, when we return, I'll talk about the problems and the challenges of interdependence. Stick around to find out. Diyan ka lang! By the way, you've heard me talk about the Inner Child course, 30 Days of Creative Prompt. But because this course is so dope, I want you to try it. I actually made the first 5 prompts free. So it's called the 5-day creative prompt. And so I invite you to take that on, whether you end up buying the 30 days course or not. That would be up to you. But I give that as a gift to you. You can get access to this 5-day free Inner Child prompt by visiting the show notes. All you need to do is set up a quick account, just your name and your email, and you can get access to it. I'm excited for you. I look forward to your inner child healing. You know what helps this podcast? Sharing it to your titas, to your ates, to your kuyas, to your dad. Because if you find it helpful and it gives you a wider, hopefully, perspective on life and navigating your world as a Filipino or someone who knows a Filipino, they will too care by sharing. Welcome back. Thanks for being here with me. Again, it's Roanne talking about the beautiful thing about interdependence. For me, interdependence is being so connected, so attuned. It's the feeling that you're not alone, that your action affects others and others influence you, that you're human. It sounds so human when I hear that word. And also, we're ever growing, ever evolving. And what I love about that when we teach that in our culture is not only that you could depend on someone, that the emphasis is that you are dependable, that someone can rely on you. Now, the shadow side, because anything that's beautiful, and we take it to the extreme, has its shadow side. We take interdependence to the extreme. We could be enmesh. That's a term, a psychological term. Let me give you a picture of what enmesh look like. If you ribbon your hands together, my mic almost fell, but if you, what do you call that? Like if you intertwine your hands together, when you're enmesh with someone, it's difficult to know which finger belongs to whom. That is when we need some space. You should be able to distinguish, that's my finger, and then that's my mother's finger. So that's one of the shadow side of interdependence when taken to the extreme. And there are many more, but that is one that I think is related to our topic of setting boundaries. Now, another shadow side of the opposite side, which is being too independent. Now, there's also a lot of useful things about being independent. I appreciate that as a Filipino immigrant, to be able to critically think about issues and topics, to be independent, even just physically independent, like being able to eat at a restaurant by yourself and not feel weird about it, because we're kind of conditioned to be in groups in the Philippines. And not that no one does that in the Philippines, it's more of a common type of conditioning. Now, going back, right, too much independence, you may forget that your action benefit or could also disadvantage others. And this is what I see. We can become detached. This can happen when you have a negative experience about being too close with someone. And if that closeness also is so pleasurable, because we all have that longing as humans, but also painful. It's very confusing. Whatever was so pleasing can also be so painful. You could bring up a steel gate boundary when you finally realize this is not helpful to you. Instead of a border, so going back to your image of what a boundary looks like for you, instead of this beautiful border of flowers, you might put up a steel gate boundary. And I totally understand, because you want to feel safe. But if you do this long enough, if it's just very rigid boundaries, your relationship could also lose its luster. If it's all just about being safe. Now, don't take me wrong, because as a therapist, I know you need to be safe. Safety is very important. But people get older and that's all they get, rather than deep connection, which takes risk. People on the other side, if you have a steel gate boundary that's so rigid, and because you know somebody wronged you, that you're like never gonna talk to them again. I'm not saying you should. That would be your own personal reflection and judgment. But sometimes when you sometimes when your boundary is so rigid, people who shouldn't be entering your space continues to lurk around. They're looking in because they can't see through. Unlike if it were a boundary of flowers, they're not sure if they're welcome or not because it's close. So they try harder to penetrate it, to get in, unless proven otherwise. I want you to know that you and I, can find a beautiful balance when it comes to setting healthy boundaries. First, it starts with your imagery, the feeling. Even if you had a steel gate boundary as your imagery, maybe you could shrink down that steel gate just a tad, just for today, at this moment as you're listening. Maybe if it's dark, maybe it could be a light gray. Just changing it a bit, slowly. And sometimes it's possible that you may need therapy if there's really deep-seated pain, woundedness there. That self-talk, just telling yourself it's okay, I need a flower boundary, may not be enough. But imagine this as you're listening. Imagining your body as your house, and imagining that you could set up boundary, border, let's call it a border. What do you see? Maybe you can paint that border a color that is pleasing to your eyes, that feels good to you. You're telling people, this is my house. I welcome you, but sometimes I also don't welcome you, or I might not welcome you just yet. But this is my house. Continue to visualize. What would you grow in that border of yours? Imagine people coming in, people that you want to welcome, entering your home. How does that feel like? Notice that in your body. Also remember, as you're keeping this visual, when you begin to say no lovingly, okay, I say lovingly because the intention is clear. You're not trying to punish people, but you are lovingly teaching them also to honor their boundaries. Who knows? People who violate other people's boundary usually have theirs been violated in the past. It's very important. Your right tone, your intent that's clear is crucial. Sometimes you might need to speak to a friend, write all your painful memories into your journal, or speak to a therapist. I wish you a beautiful border. And just like any garden, sometimes there are thorny plants that can grow, but they all belong. They all have a space there, makes the garden more beautiful. And the plants, people that aren't going to serve you, not today, probably not ever, they know this is not the house for them. They know because your boundaries are clear. Give yourself a softer, a more flexible boundary, one that really serves you. A steel gate, like a castle-like boundary. In history, they do that. The reason why we have castles is because we want to drive people away, not to come in. A boundary is meant to invite people in. And when yours is clear, that beautiful boundary that you create, whether it's with flowers or not, is actually a service for you and those around you. I'm gonna leave you with that. Thank you po for listening at maraming salamat. And again, sa ulitin. Bye na.